I started noticing the tracks 3 weeks after I left Shepherd's Ridge. Not animal tracks, not human either. Something that pressed into the hardpan dirt with a weight that didn't match its stride. The prints were deep near the heel, shallow at the toe, like whatever made them was constantly shifting its balance. I found the first set near a dried creek bed where I'd stopped to filter rust-colored water through a cloth. 4 impressions in the dust, spaced too far apart for walking, too close together for running. They led toward a stand of dead trees and then just stopped, as if the thing had simply ceased to exist mid-step. I told myself it was the wind. Erosion, my eyes playing tricks after too many days of squinting against the white glare of an irradiated sky. But I knew better. You don't survive 2 years in the waste by ignoring things that don't add up. The settlement I'd left behind wasn't much 11 people living in the husk of what used to be a grain storage facility, concrete walls thick enough to keep out most of the radiation and all of the wind. They'd taken me in after I stumbled across their perimeter half dead from dehydration, skin blistered from sun and fallout both. They fed me, gave me a corner to sleep in, asked nothing in return except that I pull my weight. For 6 months I did. Patched holes in the walls, helped sort through scavenged junk, stood watch when it was my turn. Then Marissa went missing. She was the one who knew which plants you could eat and which ones would make your gums bleed. She'd go out every few days with a canvas bag and come back with handfuls of bitter greens and tuberous roots that tasted like dirt but kept you alive. One morning she left before sunrise. By evening we were standing outside the gates, scanning the horizon with binoculars held together with electrical tape. We found her bag 2 miles east, lying in the shadow of a rusted billboard advertising something called Sunset Sarsaparilla. The bag was torn open. The plants she'd gathered were scattered in the dirt, already starting to wilt. There was no blood, no signs of struggle. Just the bag and the plants, and a set of those same strange tracks, leading away into the wastes. So faint they might have been shadows. They sent out search parties. I went with the first group, 5 of us moving in a loose line, weapons ready, eyes on the horizon. We found nothing. The second day we split up to cover more ground. Still nothing. By the third day the search had narrowed to just me and a man named Corin, an older fellow with a radiation-scarred face and a hunting rifle he'd kept since before the world ended. He moved slow, methodical, scanning the ground like he was reading a language I'd never learned. "You see that?" he said, crouching near a cluster of rocks. I looked where he was pointing. There was a smear of something dark on the stone, already dried to a crust. Could have been blood. Could have been a dozen other things. "Could be hers," he said. "Could be anything," I said. He stood, dusted off his knees, and looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. "You really think she just walked off? I think people disappear out here all the time." "Not Marissa," he said. "She knew the land." We searched until the light started to fail, then turned back. Neither of us said much on the walk home. By the time we reached the settlement, the others had already given up. They held a vigil that night, standing in a circle around a small fire, speaking in low voices about how she'd been kind, how she'd saved them from starving more than once. I stood at the edge of the circle and watched the flames, trying not to think about the tracks. I left 3 days later. It wasn't because I was scared. It was because I realized everyone else was, and fear is contagious in a way nothing else is. You could see it in how they moved, the way they'd pause mid-step to listen, how they'd glance over their shoulders at nothing. Someone started saying they'd heard something in the night, a sound like breathing, low and wet, coming from just beyond the walls. Someone else swore they'd seen a shape moving past the windows, tall and thin, silhouetted against the stars. The stories started small, just nervous talk around the fire, but they grew. Within a week, people were refusing to go outside after dark. Within 2 weeks, they were rationing ammunition, keeping weapons close even when there was nothing to shoot at. I've seen what fear does to a group. I've watched it turn people into something brittle and sharp, seen them start to fracture under the weight of their own paranoia. I didn't want to be there when it broke. So I packed what little I had: a bedroll, a canteen, a knife with a handle wrapped in fraying cord, and I left before dawn, slipping out through a gap in the fence that no one had bothered to repair. No one tried to stop me. No one even noticed. The tracks started showing up 2 days into my walk. At first I thought I was imagining it. I'd see a depression in the dust that looked like it might be a footprint, but when I knelt to examine it, the edges were too soft, too uncertain. I'd convince myself it was nothing and keep moving. Then I'd see another one and another, always off to the side, never quite where I was walking. They followed the same route I did, paralleling my path but never crossing it, as if whatever made them was content to keep its distance. I told myself it was coincidence. The waste is full of things that leave marks: animals, wind, shifting soil, but the tracks kept appearing, and they always looked the same: deep at the heel, shallow at the toe, spaced just slightly too far apart. By the third day I started walking faster. The landscape out here is a study in uniformity. Flat plains broken by clusters of dead trees and the occasional ruin, everything coated in a fine layer of dust that turns the world the color of old bone. The sky is a pale, washed-out blue during the day, fading to a sickly yellow at dusk. The sun is too bright to look at directly, but it doesn't give much warmth. At night, the temperature drops fast enough to make you shiver, even when you're wrapped in every scrap of fabric you own. I found a place to sleep on the fourth night, a shallow depression in the earth sheltered by a crumbling concrete wall. I laid out my bedroll and ate a portion of the dried meat I'd brought with me, chewing slowly to make it last. The meat tasted like salt and smoke and something faintly chemical, but it filled the hollow ache in my stomach. I drank a mouthful of water, just enough to wet my throat, and then I lay down and stared up at the stars. The stars are different now. There are fewer of them, and the ones that remain seem dimmer, like they're struggling to shine through something thick and heavy. I used to know some of the constellations. My father taught me a few when I was young, but I can't find them anymore. Either they've shifted or I've forgotten. Both feel equally likely. I didn't mean to fall asleep, but exhaustion has a way of deciding for you. When I woke, it was still dark, the kind of deep, absolute darkness that makes you question whether your eyes are even open. I lay still, listening. There was no wind. No sound at all except the faint hum of my own pulse in my ears. Then I heard it. A sound like fabric dragging across stone, slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere just beyond the wall. I didn't move. My hand found the knife at my belt, fingers curling around the handle, but I didn't pull it free. Movement would make noise. Noise would give me away. So I lay there, barely breathing, listening to that soft, rasping sound as it circled the perimeter of my shelter. It stopped. I counted to 60 in my head, then 60 again. The silence stretched out, thick and oppressive. Finally, when I couldn't stand it anymore, I sat up and looked over the edge of the wall. Nothing, just the empty waste, pale and still under a sliver of moon. I didn't sleep again that night. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was an animal. A mole rat, maybe, or one of those mutated lizards that live in the cracks of old buildings. Something harmless. Something explainable. I packed up my bedroll and kept walking, pushing the memory of that sound to the back of my mind where it couldn't bother me. The tracks reappeared an hour later. They were fresher this time, the edges sharp and distinct. I knelt beside one and pressed my hand into the dirt next to it for comparison. The print was longer than my hand, narrower, with a strange asymmetry that made it hard to look at. There were no claw marks, no indication of toes or pads, just a smooth, oval depression, like something had pressed down with immense weight and then lifted away without disturbing the surrounding soil. I stood and scanned the horizon. Nothing moved. The landscape was as empty as it had been every other day, but I felt it then, for the first time, that prickling awareness at the back of your neck, the sensation of being observed. I turned in a slow circle, searching for any sign of movement, any flicker of shadow that didn't belong. There was nothing, just the wind beginning to pick up, stirring the dust into small, lazy spirals. I started walking again, faster now, my eyes flicking between the ground and the distance. The tracks kept pace with me, always just off to the side, never quite close enough to intersect my path. Twice I stopped abruptly, hoping to catch whatever was making them off guard. Both times I saw nothing. The second time I shouted, my voice cracking in the dry air. "I know you're there." The words hung in the silence, unanswered. I waited, hand on my knife, every muscle tensed. Nothing happened. After a minute I started walking again, my heart hammering in my chest. That's when I realized the tracks had stopped appearing in front of me. I glanced back over my shoulder. There, pressed into the dust directly behind me, was a fresh print. I hadn't heard a thing, hadn't felt the ground shift or sensed any movement. It was just there, as if it had always been there, waiting for me to notice. I ran. Not far, just far enough to put some distance between myself and that print, far enough to feel like I'd done something other than stand there frozen. When I finally stopped, chest heaving, I looked back. The print was still visible, a dark smudge against the pale earth. And beyond it, spaced at regular intervals, was a line of identical prints leading back the way I'd come. I didn't stop walking until the sun was directly overhead. The thing about fear is that it changes how you move. You stop walking in straight lines. You start taking detours, looping back on yourself, trying to break whatever pattern you've fallen into. You stop trusting shadows. You stop trusting silence. Every sound becomes a potential threat. Every shift in the wind a warning. Your body starts making decisions before your mind catches up, tensing at nothing, flinching at the scrape of your own boot against stone. I found a cluster of ruins that afternoon, the remains of what might have been a small town once. Most of the buildings had collapsed, their walls reduced to piles of rubble and twisted rebar, but a few structures still stood, skeletal and defiant. I picked my way through the debris, looking for anything useful. Sometimes you find supplies in places like this: canned food, ammunition, tools. More often you find nothing but rust and broken glass. There was a building near the center of the ruins that looked more intact than the others. The roof had caved in on one side, but the walls were solid and the doorway was clear. I stepped inside, letting my eyes adjust to the dimness. The interior was a mess of overturned furniture and rotting fabric, everything coated in a layer of dust so thick it muffled my footsteps. There was a smell, too, something sour and organic, like decay. I was halfway across the room when I noticed the marks on the walls. They were scratches, deep gouges in the plaster, running in long, parallel lines from floor to ceiling. Some were clustered together, overlapping, as if whatever made them had returned to the same spot over and over. Others stood alone, isolated and stark. I stepped closer, running my fingers along one of the grooves. It was smooth, almost polished, as if it had been worn down over time. There were other marks, too. Stains on the floor, dark and irregular, spreading out from the center of the room like roots. I crouched beside one and touched it with the tip of my finger. It was dry, flaking away at the slightest pressure. Old blood, maybe. Or something worse. I left the building quickly, not bothering to search the rest of it. Whatever had happened there, I didn't want to linger. The sun was starting to dip toward the horizon by the time I made it through the ruins. I kept moving, putting distance between myself and that place, but the image of those scratches stayed with me. I couldn't stop thinking about the pattern they made, the deliberateness of it. They weren't random. They were intentional, methodical, like someone or something had been trying to communicate. I camped that night in the open, too paranoid to risk another enclosed space. I built a small fire using scraps of wood I'd scavenged from the ruins, more for the comfort of light than for warmth. The flames were small and weak, barely enough to push back the darkness, but they were something. I sat close, staring into the embers, trying not to think about the scratches or the tracks or the sound I'd heard the night before. The fire burned down to coals. I let it die. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear something, a scrape, a rustle, the faint whisper of movement, and I'd jerk awake, hand already reaching for my knife. The darkness felt heavier out here, more oppressive, like it was pressing down on me from all sides. I could feel my pulse in my throat, fast and erratic, and no matter how many times I told myself there was nothing out there, I couldn't make myself believe it. Somewhere in the small hours of the morning, I heard it again, that dragging sound, slow and deliberate, circling just beyond the reach of the dying firelight. I sat up, knife in hand, and stared into the darkness. I could see shapes vague, indistinct forms that might have been rocks or might have been something else. They didn't move, didn't make a sound. But I could feel them, the weight of their presence, like a pressure against my skin. I didn't sleep again. By dawn I was moving, my legs stiff and aching, my thoughts sluggish from exhaustion. The landscape hadn't changed. It was still the same endless expanse of dust and ruin, the same pale sky, the same distant horizon. But it felt different now, smaller. Like the world was contracting around me, tightening its grip. The tracks were waiting for me when I stopped to rest. They were everywhere, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, crisscrossing the ground in a chaotic tangle that made my head hurt to look at. They circled my campsite from the night before, overlapping and intersecting, as if whatever made them had spent hours pacing back and forth, deciding. Some led away into the waste. Others looped back on themselves, forming tight spirals that ended abruptly in the middle of nowhere. I stood in the center of the chaos, turning slowly, trying to make sense of it. There was a pattern here, I was sure of it, but I couldn't see it. My eyes kept sliding off the tracks, refusing to focus, and the harder I tried, the more confused I became. It was like looking at something that existed in more dimensions than I could perceive, something that didn't fit inside the rules of the world I knew. I left without looking back. The days started to blur together after that. Walking, stopping, walking again. I stopped keeping track of time, stopped trying to measure distance. The only thing that mattered was forward, one foot in front of the other, away from whatever was behind me. But it was always behind me. I'd hear it in the quiet moments, when the wind died down and the world went still. That dragging sound, that soft, wet breathing. Sometimes it was close enough that I could feel it, a shift in the air, a presence just out of sight. Other times it was distant, faint, barely there at all, but it was always there. I started talking to myself to fill the silence, not out loud, just in my head, a constant stream of observations and instructions. Keep walking, don't look back, you're fine. You're going to be fine. The words didn't mean anything, but they gave me something to focus on, something other than the creeping certainty that I was being followed. The tracks changed. They were closer now, no longer content to parallel my path. They crossed in front of me, behind me, sometimes appearing directly in my footsteps as if whatever made them was walking in my shadow. I tried changing direction, cutting hard to the left or right, but it didn't matter. The tracks followed. I started to wonder if I was making them myself. If exhaustion and fear had twisted my perception so badly that I was seeing threats where none existed. But then I'd crouch beside a print and press my hand into it, feel the depth and weight of it, and I'd know. This wasn't me. This was something else. I found a road on the 7th day, or maybe it was the 8th. Time had stopped meaning much by then. The road was cracked and overgrown, barely distinguishable from the surrounding earth, but it was there, a faint line cutting through the waste, leading somewhere. I followed it because it was easier than not following it, because the alternative was to keep wandering with no destination, no purpose, no hope of finding anything except more dust and more silence. The road led to a town. It wasn't much. A dozen buildings clustered around a central square, most of them collapsed or collapsing, their windows empty and dark. There were signs of life, though recent life. A rusted shopping cart tipped on its side near the entrance, a length of rope strung between two buildings, still holding scraps of faded fabric, tire tracks in the dirt, not yet eroded by wind. I moved cautiously, knife in hand, scanning the buildings for movement. The town felt wrong. Too quiet, too still, like it was holding its breath. I found the bodies in the square. There were 3 of them, lying in a rough triangle, their limbs twisted at angles that didn't make sense. They'd been dead for a while, long enough for the scavengers to have their turn, long enough for the sun to do its work. What was left was leathery and desiccated, barely recognizable as human. But it was the way they were arranged that made me stop. They were facing inward, toward each other, as if they'd been standing in a circle when they died. And in the center of the triangle, pressed into the dirt, was a single print. Same shape, same depth, same unnatural spacing. I backed away slowly, not taking my eyes off the bodies. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it, a dull thud that drowned out everything else. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. They felt heavy, sluggish, like they were moving through something thick and resistant. That's when I heard the voice. "You shouldn't be here." I spun around, knife raised, but there was no one there, just the empty square, the collapsed buildings, the pale sky overhead. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice hoarse. No answer. Just the wind, picking up now, stirring the dust into small eddies that danced across the square. I left the town quickly, not bothering to search it, not caring what supplies might be hidden in those dark, empty buildings. I walked until my legs were shaking, until the town was nothing but a smudge on the horizon behind me, and even then, I didn't stop. I kept moving, driven by a fear I couldn't name, couldn't explain. The tracks were waiting for me when I finally collapsed. I didn't see them at first. I was too busy trying to catch my breath, too focused on the ache in my legs and the dryness in my throat. But when I looked up, there they were, dozens of them, arranged in a perfect circle around me, each one facing inward. I was in the center, just like those bodies in the square. I scrambled to my feet, nearly tripping over my own boots, and staggered out of the circle. My pulse was racing, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the knife. I scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of movement, any indication of what had made those tracks. Nothing, just the empty waste, stretching out in every direction. But I could feel it now. Not just the presence, but the intent. It was watching me, studying me, and it had been doing so for days, maybe longer, learning my patterns, my habits, my fears. Every step I'd taken, every choice I'd made, it had been there, observing, cataloging, waiting. I started running again. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning, collapsing into a single, unbroken moment of panic and exhaustion. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Because stopping meant giving it a chance to catch up, and I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. The landscape changed as I ran. The flat plains gave way to rolling hills, then to rocky outcroppings that jutted from the earth like broken teeth. I climbed over them, slid down their sides, scraping my hands and knees on the rough stone. Blood welled up from the cuts, hot and sticky, but I didn't care. Pain was distant, irrelevant. All that mattered was distance. I found a cave as the sun was setting. It was small, barely large enough for me to crawl inside, but it was shelter. I wedged myself into the opening, pressing my back against the cold stone, and stared out at the darkening sky. My breath came in ragged gasps, each one burning in my chest. I could taste blood in my mouth, coppery and sharp. I waited for the tracks to appear. They didn't. The night passed in agonizing slowness. I didn't sleep, didn't even close my eyes. I just sat there, knife in hand, watching the entrance to the cave, waiting for something to fill it. But nothing came. The darkness remained empty, undisturbed. By the time the sun rose, I was so tense my muscles ached, so exhausted I could barely move. I crawled out of the cave into the pale morning light and looked around. No tracks, no signs of pursuit, just the rocky terrain, silent and still. I almost laughed, almost convinced myself that I'd imagined it all, that exhaustion and dehydration had twisted my perception into something monstrous. But then I saw it, a single print pressed into the dust at the base of the hill. It was facing the cave. I ran again. The hills gave way to a dry riverbed, its banks crumbling and unstable. I followed it north, stumbling over rocks and driftwood, too tired to care where I was going. The riverbed widened, then narrowed, then widened again, carving a serpentine path through the landscape. I kept moving, driven by an instinct I couldn't name, a certainty that stopping meant death. The riverbed led to a canyon. It was narrow, its walls steep and jagged, rising up on either side like the jaws of some enormous creature. The floor was littered with debris, rocks, bones, scraps of metal. I picked my way through it, my footsteps echoing off the walls, amplified into something loud and monstrous. Halfway through the canyon I stopped. There, carved into the wall, was a message. It was crude, scratched into the stone with something sharp, the letters uneven and shaky. But it was legible. It knows your name. I stared at the message, my mind struggling to process it. Who had written it? When? And how did they know I'd come this way? I reached out and touched the letters, feeling the rough edges of the scratches. They were old, weathered by time and wind, but they were deliberate, intentional. Someone had stood in this exact spot and carved these words, knowing that someone else would find them. I looked around, suddenly aware of how exposed I was. The canyon walls rose up on either side, trapping me, funneling me forward. There was no way out except through. I kept walking. The canyon opened into a valley, wide and shallow, its floor covered in a strange, pale grass that crunched under my boots. The air here felt different, thicker, heavier, like it was saturated with something I couldn't see. I moved slowly, scanning the valley for any sign of movement. That's when I saw the structure. It was in the center of the valley, rising up from the grass like a monument. At first I thought it was a building, some pre-war relic that had somehow survived the bombs. But as I got closer, I realized it was something else. It was built from bones, human bones, animal bones, bones I couldn't identify. They were stacked and woven together, forming a tower that reached toward the sky, its surface bleached white by the sun. I should have left, should have turned around and walked away as fast as I could, but I didn't. I kept moving toward it, drawn by a curiosity I couldn't explain, a need to understand. The tower was covered in marks, scratches, symbols, words in a language I didn't recognize. They covered every surface, overlapping and intersecting, forming patterns that hurt to look at. I reached out and touched one, tracing the shape with my finger. The bone was smooth, almost polished, and it felt warm under my hand, like it was radiating heat. That's when I heard the voice again. "You came." I spun around, knife raised, but there was no one there, just the valley, empty and silent. "I knew you would," the voice continued. It was soft, almost gentle, but there was something wrong with it. It didn't echo, didn't resonate. It just existed, flat and directionless. "Where are you?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "I'm here," the voice said. "I've always been here." I turned in a slow circle, searching for the source. The valley was empty. The tower stood silent, its bones gleaming in the fading light. There was nothing. No one. "You've been running," the voice said. "But you can't run from me. I'm already inside." My hands started to shake. The knife felt heavy, useless. "What do you want?" "I want to understand," the voice said. "I want to know what you are." "I'm human," I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. I'm just trying to survive." "Survival," the voice repeated, as if tasting the word. "Such a small thing, such a fragile thing. You cling to it with such desperation, even when you know it's futile." "It's not futile," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" the voice asked. "You've already lost. You lost the moment you started running, but you kept going, didn't you? Even when you knew, even when you understood." I wanted to argue, to deny it, but I couldn't, because it was right. Some part of me had known from the beginning that this was how it would end. I'd known when I left Shepherd's Ridge. I'd known when I found those first tracks. I'd known every time I looked over my shoulder and saw nothing, because nothing was worse than something. Nothing meant I couldn't fight it, couldn't prepare for it, couldn't do anything except wait. "What are you?" I asked. The voice didn't answer immediately. When it did, it sounded almost sad. "I'm what happens when you stop pretending." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. I wanted to ask what they meant, but I already knew. I'd known for days, maybe longer. The thing in the waste wasn't a creature. It wasn't a monster. It was the inevitability of this place, the truth that everyone who survives out here eventually learns. You can run, you can fight, you can cling to hope with everything you have, but in the end, the waste always wins. It grinds you down, strips away everything you thought you were, until all that's left is the raw, desperate animal underneath. And I'd been running from that truth for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand still. I lowered the knife. The sun was setting now, painting the valley in shades of orange and red. The tower of bones cast a long shadow across the grass, reaching toward me like a hand. I stared at it, feeling something inside me finally break. "What happens now?" I asked. "You choose," the voice said. "You can keep running. You can walk into the dark and hope you find something on the other side. Or you can stay. And if I stay, then you stop pretending." I looked down at the knife in my hand. It was a simple thing, just a piece of sharpened metal wrapped in cord. But it had kept me alive. It had given me something to hold on to when everything else felt uncertain. I turned it over in my palm, feeling its weight, its balance. Then I dropped it. The knife hit the ground with a soft thud, disappearing into the pale grass. I watched it fall, feeling something shift inside me, not relief, exactly, but something close. An easing of tension, a letting go. The voice didn't speak again. I stood there in the valley as the sun dipped below the horizon, as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The temperature dropped, the wind picked up, but I didn't move. I just stood there, waiting, as the night closed in around me. The tracks appeared in the darkness. I couldn't see them, but I could feel them, the displacement of air, the faint tremor in the ground. They circled me slowly, methodically, drawing closer with each pass. I didn't run, didn't reach for a weapon. I just stood there, eyes closed, listening to the sound of my own breathing. When it touched me, I didn't flinch. It wasn't a hand, wasn't anything I could name, just a pressure, cold and weightless, pressing against my back. It moved up my spine, along my shoulders, across my neck. I felt it mapping me, learning the shape of my bones, the texture of my skin. It lingered at the base of my skull, where fear lives, where memory hides. And then it was inside. Not physically, not in any way I could explain. But I felt it there, moving through the corridors of my mind, sifting through thoughts and memories like pages in a book. It saw everything, every mistake, every regret, every moment of weakness. It saw the person I'd been before the world ended and the person I'd become after. It saw the lies I told myself to keep going, the truths I buried because they were too painful to face. And it understood. The thing in the waste wasn't hunting me because I was prey, it was hunting me because I was interesting. Because I'd done something that most people don't. I'd survived long enough to see the shape of my own dissolution, and I'd kept running anyway, even when I knew it was pointless. Even when I knew I'd already lost. It withdrew slowly, like water draining from a wound. I opened my eyes and found myself alone in the valley, the tower of bones standing silent in the darkness. The tracks were gone, the presence was gone, but I could still feel it, faint and distant, like an echo that never quite fades. I stood there for a long time, not thinking, not moving, just existing in the space between breaths, in the quiet that follows realization. Eventually, I started walking. Not back, not forward, just walking, because that's what you do when there's nothing left to run from. The valley gave way to plains, and the plains gave way to hills, and the hills gave way to flatlands again. The sun rose and set. Days passed, or maybe weeks. I stopped keeping track, stopped caring. The world continued to decay around me, the same way it always had, the same way it always would. But something had changed. I noticed it in the way I moved slower, more deliberate. I stopped looking over my shoulder, stopped flinching at shadows. The fear was still there, buried deep, but it had lost its edge. It was just another part of the landscape now, as permanent and unremarkable as the dust or the ruins or the pale, indifferent sky. I thought about Marissa sometimes, about Corin and the others at Shepherd's Ridge. I wondered if they were still alive, still standing watch at the gates, still telling stories around the fire. I wondered if they thought about me at all, or if I'd already faded into the background noise of the waste, just another person who walked out and never came back. It didn't matter. None of it mattered. That was the lesson the thing had taught me, not through words, but through its presence, through the simple act of watching and waiting. The waste doesn't care what you've lost or what you're running from. It doesn't care if you survive or if you disappear. It just is, and you just are, and the space between those two truths is where you live. I found another settlement eventually. It was larger than Shepherd's Ridge, more organized, with walls made of scavenged metal and guards who actually looked alert. They let me in after a brief interrogation, assigned me a bunk, gave me work to do. I fell into the rhythm of it easily: wake, eat, work, sleep. It was simple, uncomplicated. I didn't tell them about the thing in the waste, didn't mention the tracks or the tower or the voice. They wouldn't have believed me anyway, and even if they did, it wouldn't have mattered. Because the thing wasn't a threat they could defend against. It wasn't something you could shoot or stab or scare away. It was just there, waiting, patient, studying the ones who lasted long enough to catch its attention. Sometimes, late at night, I'd stand at the edge of the settlement and stare out into the darkness. I'd search for signs of it, tracks, sounds, movement. I never found anything, but I could feel it, distant and constant, like the hum of electricity in a dead wire. It was still watching, still waiting. And maybe, in some strange way, I was waiting too. Waiting for the day when the walls came down and the settlement fell apart and I had to start running again. Because that's what you do in the waste. You run until you can't run anymore, and then you stop, and then something finds you. And when it does, you learn what you're really made of, whether you're something worth studying or just another body in the dust. I don't think about it much anymore. The fear is still there, but it's quiet now, manageable. I've learned to carry it the way you carry any weight, distribute it evenly, keep moving. Don't think too hard about what happens when you finally set it down, because in the waste, you never really set it down. You just learn to live with it, the same way you learn to live with hunger and thirst and the slow, grinding erosion of hope. You adapt, you endure. And when something comes out of the darkness to find you, you don't run. You don't fight. You just stand there and let it see you for what you are. And maybe, if you're lucky, it lets you walk away. Most days I think I was lucky. Most days